Hi, I'm Joshua Cole. I'm here in the carriage house of the W.H. Stark House. The W.H. Stark House was built in 1895, and in many ways this home is the beginning of the modern era and the end of the Western frontier period. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So this house has a really interesting relationship to the frontier, and in many ways represents the end of the frontier. Built in 1895, the W.H. Stark House was an extremely impressive feat of engineering, technology, and just skill. And it required a lot to make it possible here. And for 20 years, the Stark family, the Letcher family, and the other families of Orange had been building the infrastructure and everything possible to make the W.H. Stark House exist. And all of those things, new roads, new infrastructure, ultimately lead to what was a lawless frontier border town turning into one of the most developed and advanced industrial cities in Texas, and one of the most important lumber capitals in the world. So, what is the frontier? Well, the simplest version of the definition of a frontier is it's the edge of something. Specifically in the context of American history, the frontier is the edge of Old World settlement coming to the New World. So European, African, Asian peoples coming largely across the Atlantic here to North America. Now, normally, especially here in Texas, when we think of the frontier, you probably have a very clear image that comes in your mind. Because the frontier, that's where the buffalo are. There are Indians out there, Native Americans, there are cowboys, very wild, beautiful desert vistas. That's what we kind of think of as the frontier. But actually, the frontier is constantly moving throughout history. For instance, around the time of the American Revolution in the 1770s, the frontier was about where the Appalachian mountain chain is today, in what we would consider the East. So the frontier is constantly moving over time and constantly expanding. Generally speaking, most history books will say the frontier is closed around 1900. And that is when we have settlement on the East Coast and settlement on the West Coast and links, specifically the railroad connecting both of them between. Now, even though that happens around 1900, there's still a lot of pockets that aren't fully settled, and there's pockets of frontier here and there and everywhere. So what's the history of the frontier here in Orange? Well, it begins with Spain. Like the history of European settlement, Spain was the first, and 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. Most of you probably know this by now. Columbus's expeditions were financed by Isabella of Spain. And so Spain really has a head start on discovering, exploring, and attempting to colonize the Americas. And Spain sends out ships all over, and they just start claiming everything. And this is no exception. This area was claimed by Spain. Actually, we were a part of the Florida claim. This was eventually called West Florida. That's the first name that was given to the area that becomes Texas. But, Spain claiming everything, that's all right and good, but other European powers we want some of this. And so they start sending out expeditions, and they start claiming things as well. And so you get to this really interesting problem where you can go out and write on a map and say, all this is mine. But what does that map actually mean? In order to control an area, you really need people there to say that you're in control. If an area is empty, or if the people that are there say that you're not in control, do you really control it? And so that's really what settlement was about. It was about getting physical control of claimed lands. Now, this area is even more interesting when it comes to the concept of the frontier, because not only were we an undeveloped frontier, we were also the frontier, the border between two of the largest empires in North America, the Spanish and the French. And that competition for this area plays a major role in why this area was developed, or really more importantly, why this area was so underdeveloped. When does settlement actually start occurring here? Well, fast forward about 100, 150 years. By the beginning of the 1800s, this area is still largely empty. Texas was actually one of the least populated parts of the entire Spanish Empire. There's just not many people here, period. There's not even that many Native Americans. There's just not a lot of people in this area. And this is becoming a bigger problem because France has lost control of Louisiana by this point, and it's become a part of the United States. And the United States is really beginning to move westward. And Spanish authorities were really getting worried that Americans would just move into Texas, because that's what they were doing. The Sabine area and this borderland was beginning to be settled in the early 1800s illegally by American settlers coming into Spanish territory, setting up colonies without permission. And so this illegal immigration was really starting to cause a major problem for the Spanish Empire. And they decided, you know what, we need to find a way to turn this illegal immigration into legal immigration so we can get legal, law-abiding, tax-paying Spanish citizens in Texas. And so they begin to set up a framework to allow American settlers to come to Texas legally. Now, they don't get very far in this because, of course, the Mexican Revolution, Mexican independence. Mexico breaks away from Spain, but the early Mexican governments, they decide that this Spanish idea of settlement actually is a pretty good idea. So in 1824, they establish a law called the General Colonization Law. And that sets up the rules to allow people like Austin to come to Texas legally. And they've got some really strict restrictions on it. The Mexican authorities were very concerned that what eventually happened would happen. That the United States would have a lot of settlers come here, and eventually those people coming from the United States would want to join the United States. So what they wanted to try and do is to get settlers in a place grouped together where they could be controlled. It was illegal to settle within 60, 70 miles of the Sabine River or within about 30 miles of the coast, which really explains why so many people were in that sort of middle section. Houston today is about the edge of where was legal to settle. So anyone who was in this area was here illegally. The town that is here in orange, it was originally called Madison. That town doesn't incorporate until 1836. What happens in 1836? Texas! The Texas Revolution and Texas independence. The fact that they incorporated in 1836 means there was already a town here. So there was already a town settled by illegal immigrants in what becomes Orange. So that process really does affect the way that Texas settles, because the big settlements, the legal settlements, were in the middle part of the state. So whereas most places settle from the edges or along rivers, places that are easy to get access to, Texas settles from the middle out, which is really very rare and really pretty unique in American history. So what this means is Orange is actually a frontier area. It's the undeveloped frontier in between the developed Central Texas and the developed Mississippi River Basin. So, closing the Orange frontier. This really begins in 1877. This area remained unsettled for a lot of reasons. It was difficult to access. There really also wasn't much here. It was mostly swamp, forest, but that very thing made it very attractive to a man named Henry Jacob Letcher. In 1877, he comes down here with his business partner, and they decide that Orange, right here at the bottom of the Sindine River, with access to the ocean, is the perfect place to take advantage of that extremely important resource that had actually stopped other development, the forests. You see, the forests were so thick and so dominant here, it was difficult to do typical activities on a small farm. It was just forests. Henry Jacob saw dollar signs because not only were there a huge amount of trees, the tree that was dominant in this area was the longleaf pine. And the longleaf pine really is a very incredible tree. Sadly, we really don't have hardly any of them, but at one time, pretty much all of East Texas and western Louisiana was just a longleaf pine forest. One of the main reasons we don't have them today is they take a long time to grow. Anywhere from 100 to 300 years for a longleaf pine to fully develop. But that means they have all of the oils of a softwood with all the density of a hardwood. So it really is an amazing tree. And Henry Jacob loved it. Here's what he said about the forests in this area in his own words. For Henry Jacob, it's a no-brainer. Moving to Orange is a brilliant business decision that ultimately makes him a very wealthy man. But it's a far more difficult and complicated decision for his family, especially for his daughters, especially for his oldest daughter, Miriam, who at this time is in her late teens. And she actually has a lot of options. And moving to Orange isn't necessarily the best one. Her entire life has been in Williamsport. And while she was not raised rich, she had a very comfortable life in Williamsport and had a very comfortable middle-class lifestyle. Her father was originally a butcher, and so she was raised a butcher's daughter. And she had this really interesting life where, on the weekdays she's going to finishing school, learning all the things a proper young lady should, and on the weekends, she's helping her family out in the butcher shop doing things like cleaning tripe. If you don't know what that is, Google it. It is pretty terrible. So she was a very practical girl in a lot of ways, and she was someone who had a lot of important decisions to make. Coming to Orange was a real difficult one. Williamsport was a fully developed modern industrial town. Orange was an undeveloped frontier lawless border town. So for Miriam, Orange really is a backwater little frontier town in an alien, different place. That's not the same for everyone. For the man she would eventually marry, WilliamHenry Stark, Orange is the big city. Orange is a ton of opportunity. He had a very different upbringing than his wife. William was raised on the frontier of East Texas in an area with very little infrastructure, very little development, and for him, Orange represented opportunity. William's father was a postman who didn't really like to deliver mail, which meant that it was actually William who did a lot of the work. And so William spent most of his middle and late teens traveling all over the eastern half of Texas. And he picks Orange, which already, even before Henry Jacob comes down to build the Letcher Lumber Company, already had a small lumber industry, had a lot of things that William had never had growing up, in really a very tragic childhood. Unlike Miriam, who lived really just a very sheltered life in a relatively safe, modern city with just her sister, just the two of them, William was the oldest boy of eventually 18 children, and actually spent much of what we would consider childhood having to work like an adult, because His father went off to war during the Civil War when he was about 11, 12, and left him to run the farm with the help of his mother and grandmother. And his mother actually dies halfway through the Civil War. So there's a lot of tragedy, and it also meant that William had to grow up very quickly. And so by the time he's in his late teens, when he's deciding, I really need to leave home, he has had about 10 years of working experience, and he's a very confident person in his own right. And he had to be, because his father did not approve of his move to Orange. When he decides to leave for Orange, let's just say his father had a lot to say.
I've had many trials in my life, but always before my own house and kindred were supporting me. Now those I have loved best have stabbed me in the most tender point. You forsake your father and go with strangers. You leave me when I tell you that I need you most. Now I command you to return. Let us see whether my commands have any weight with you or not. My own son has deserted me. Life is but little worth to me. If there were any inducement, I could excuse your conduct, but there can be none.
For William, that's the difficult decision. Leave home because I know it's the right thing for me. For Miriam, it's a lot more difficult because she really has to pick her nuclear family, her sister, her mother, her father, going to a totally new area versus the rest of her family and her whole world. Miriam's faced with this massive decision. How is she going to make up her mind? Well, actually, William plays a big role in it. Miriam's in her late teens, and she's finishing up school, and it's really becoming her responsibility to make these major decisions. You know, do I want to stay in Williamsport? She actually had some teaching opportunities where she, and actually did teach a little while in Williamsport. So she has the possibility of actually maybe making a bit of an independent life for herself in Williamsport. All her family's there. But she does begin to meet people here in Orange on her trips. The most important is William. And William makes his mind up pretty quickly that he wants Miriam to be a part of his future. And it starts off a bit slow, but when Miriam goes back on one of her trips, the former mailman uses letters to try and win the girl of his dreams. And we really have this pretty incredible story, because she kept all of his letters, of him courting her long distance using mail. And the letters say a lot of things, and mostly gossip, but slowly he's building this case for Miriam. So basically, this is what William says. Miriam, if you move down here to Orange, we're going to make Orange incredible together. We're going to work with your family, we're going to do all these things, and I promise you we're going to make Orange just as nice. You know what? We're going to make it better than Williamsport. I'm going to make Orange as comfortable and as nice as possible for you. This promise, ultimately, and I think the fact that she did kind of fall in love with him, this promise really does help Miriam make up her mind. And it plays a major role in Orange history. By the late 1880s, just 10 years after the Letcher Lumber Company opens, Orange has developed into a major industrial center and one of the most important lumber towns really in the world. 20 years later, Orange has some incredible new technologies that are some major firsts on a global scale. The Stockhouse, when it was built in 1895, had electricity and indoor plumbing. One of the first homes in the world to have those two technologies in that first generation. Even more impressive, in 1912, the Letcher Memorial Chapel opens up. That church, built by Frances Ann, Miriam's mother, in honor of Henry Jacob, was one of the most advanced in the world. Beautiful stained glass windows and air conditioning in 1912. The family's decision to invest here in Orange really was very important and wasn't really the norm. Oftentimes, very rich families would have the mill in a mill town and then would invest all their money in major centers. The family really invested most of their money here in Orange, and it led to the creation and development of a lot of things. And many of that early on was things like roads, power plants, but it continues to this day. All of the Stark cultural venues that currently are in Orange are a result of the family's development. The Letcher Theater, Shangri-La Gardens, the Stark Museum of Art, the W.A. Stockhouse. All of these things exist ultimately because two people made their decision to make their lives here in Orange. Should you stay? Should you go? History oftentimes feels really big, really important, and like these people way back then made these giant decisions and had it all figured out, and had this big glorious plan. Really, there was a lot of risk for William when he left home. His father could have been right. Moving to Orange could have been terrible. For Miriam, she was leaving her entire world, everything she'd ever known, for the unknown. Ultimately, we know that for them, their decisions had huge impacts on their lives, and they were able to have a really incredible life and a very impactful life together here in Orange. Decisions matter. They're not simple, and they're not easy, and they never have been. Should you stay, should you go, was just as difficult for Miriam as it might be for decisions that you'll face in your lives.